in collaboration with the Cyprus Mail. This is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Haralambous.
Coming up on this week's programme, we discuss at length the conditions under which particularly migrant workers are asked to labour.
They force Muslims to go and work in pig farms. They force women with infants to go and work in farms and sleep with other men in the same room, with a baby, with a 3-month-old baby.
And we hear about a study into how the environment could act as a peace-building mechanism on our island.
Even though on one hand there's been some work done in order to understand how the environment has been used and what is the potential of the environment towards peace building on Cyprus, we don't feel it has been explored enough.
We're going to talk on the programme this week about migrants, legal and illegal, and the exploitative practices in the labour market. Joining us to discuss the issue is Corina Dimitriou, who is an expert in this field, has worked for many years and researched not only migration but also facts and figures from the European Union. Corina, can you first outline what the problem is?
The problem is mainly located in the institutional framework used in order to regulate the employment of migrant workers in different fields. And there are particular regulations that create conditions of vulnerability for specific fields. Migrant workers is one field, and we saw this last year with the problem of exploitative conditions and the serial killer, a series of domestic workers who had no other way in order to escape the abuse. Even though the serial killer was condemned and he's in jail for life, nothing was done to improve the institutional setting that actually led to the abuse. We see these very often with farm workers and seasonal workers. And something very recently reached the media about 3 farm workers in the Famagusta area who were identified as victims of trafficking. But actually this is not news. It's happening every year. Many cases reach the court, in fact, as a result of these people contacting NGOs and the NGOs contacting the police anti-trafficking unit, which does an excellent work, by the way. But we don't have a systemic inspection procedure to check workplaces. We only rely on complaints. So if a person has access to the complaints mechanism, then there might be a possibility for them to escape. But many never have access to the justice system, and many have to sustain the slavery conditions for years.
Are we talking here, Corina, about people who are brought to Cyprus specifically for low-paid work? Obviously, I understand that if they're female, very often they're trafficked for sexual purposes as well. But there is, of course, the trafficking of men for exactly that, low-paid work and living in appalling conditions. Do we have that here as well? Because that's slave labour.
That is correct, yes. There is a lot of that, and it's very poorly documented because there is no recording mechanism. The courts themselves do not differentiate victims between locals and third country nationals. Let me tell you about a case which is very typical, which was decided in 2017 at the Assizes Court. The case was brought by the police against the recruitment agents and the employers. They were all charged with offences including trafficking, conspiracy to trafficking, forgery, withholding of travel documents, and extreme labour exploitation. The workers were from Bangladesh. They were told a lot of lies of being able to earn 700 and 800 euros per month, and of being able to repay a loan which they create in their countries in order to be able to come. There were cases where the workers had to pay the traffickers up to 10,000 euros in order to transport them to Cyprus to find them a job, and eventually they landed on a job which was extremely low paid, sometimes with no pay at all, living in basements with one bottle of water and one plate of food a day. In this case, the victims applied to a migrant support NGO, which referred them to the anti-trafficking unit of the police. The police identified them as victims. They went to court. The police testified about the terrible working conditions that they saw on site, especially the conditions of the accommodation offered to them. Even the court was appalled by the photos that they saw. And the persons were found guilty. One of them was given 12 months imprisonment. Others were let go because they were old people. One of them had serious health issues. And the victims, very importantly, were not able to claim compensation, because to claim compensation, you have to undergo another civil procedure, not in the criminal court. I don't know the details, but I very much suspect that after that, the workers were deported, because it's not the first time that we see this.
So they wouldn't have got back the money that they paid in the first place to come here, but what happened to that money? Were the perpetrators allowed to keep it? Do we have any law that says ill-gotten gains like this should be confiscated and repaid to the people that it was taken from?
We have a law which transposes the EU sanctions directive. Actually, the legal framework is very good, because mainly it follows the EU directives. It may not be possible to locate and identify the proceeds of the trafficking, but in all cases, employers should compensate. There are very strict sanctions foreseen in the law for employers to compensate victims of trafficking. But it's very rare that victims who have been identified, who have managed to secure a conviction against their employers, manage to go to the civil court and claim compensation. Because sanctions is one thing. It's the fine that the employer pays to the state. Compensation is another. It's a civil procedure. So you need a lawyer. You need to know that the procedure exists. You need to be in Cyprus long enough, because these people do not stay long enough. If they lose their work permit, they are deported, and if from their country, they cannot continue with the proceedings.
And of course we know that court cases here take years, so that's an absolute washout in a sense. What about, though, checks, follow-up checks on employers who have done this in the past? One assumes that when one lot goes, they just bring another lot.
There is a procedure in the Labour Inspectorate Department to withhold permit to bring more workers from third countries until they have paid the sanctions. But that is something that is very easy to remedy. You just pay the sanction and then you bring more. There is no disqualification procedure. There is no procedure of certification that exists in other countries, where you need to have certification from the authorities of having a good record as an employer in order to employ vulnerable workers. We also have a directive about seasonal workers. I think that the main issue in Cyprus that exists in many economic sectors is the attachment to the particular employer. Why is it necessary for people to come only through this route? Because this is the route that is full of traffickers on your way. Why can the country not declare that they need, for instance, farm workers? Cyprus at the beginning of the season could announce we need, let's say, 500 seasonal workers. Let them come, create a trade union, and then any employer can apply to the trade union and hire workers for the period that they require them on the terms that will be monitored by their trade union.
We've also got a lot of unemployed people here, a lot of refugees and asylum seekers who need work here and who are allowed to work in the agricultural sector. They're already in Cyprus. So where do they fit into this picture? Because even seasonal work is better than no work.
Asylum seekers are allowed to work after the first month, and agriculture is one of the areas where they are permitted to work. A lot of them are not capable for work because of age, because of vulnerability, because of health issues. Those who are able to work do find work. Otherwise, their benefits, if they turn a job offer twice, then their benefits get discontinued. But this is also a system that entails a lot of distortions. For instance, they force Muslims to go and work in pig farms. They force women with infants to go and work in farms and sleep with other men in the same room with a baby, with a 3-month-old baby. And if they turn down the job, then their benefits get discontinued.
So what's the answer for this, Karina? Because surely just the basic respect for other human beings, for their faith, for their gender and for all these things would immediately show that the examples you've just given are totally unacceptable. How do we change that?
We need a good institutional framework and a total revision of the setting of attaching people to employers. Workers of different categories need to form up their own cooperatives run by them, and the people who require services need to apply to the cooperative rather than to the trafficker. The Labour Office also needs to have guidelines, and there need to be individualized examinations before they discontinue benefits, because now it just happens automatically. You turn down a job offer twice, and next thing you know, you don't have a benefit. You don't have a way to survive. So we need a systemic institutional change that takes all these issues into consideration. There are recommendations in place from the Ombudsman from 2015. It's not that they lack the knowledge or they lack the ideas. I believe that there are specific economic interests that sustain the current system of extreme exploitation.
Our Labour Minister, Zita Emilianidou, is generally, or seems to be, fairly switched on as regards these sort of incidents. So why is the Labour Inspection Department and her ministry not doing more, for example, as you say, to check? If I'm a woman with a small child, breastfeeding presumably, I do not want to be breastfeeding in front of a room full of men if I'm forced to sleep in the same room. Do they not check these things and say that is a valid reason for turning down this job?
I think what the minister is not doing right is that she's not putting forward institutional changes. If somebody has access to the Labour minister and has her mobile phone, she will fix the individual case. She will not fix the framework that produces these inequalities and exploitative conditions. So if she's aware of a particular case, yes, she will address it. But she will not bring the system up to a standard that prohibits this on a general level.
Is she in a position to do that if she wants to?
Yes, absolutely. She can bring a bill to Parliament, and I'm sure that there will be many MPs to support it.
Well,
if the government is behind it, I'm sure.
Okay, it's been a pleasure talking to you, Karina. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you,
and I look forward to seeing an improvement in these conditions. It's really appalling in 2020 to be even talking about this, actually.
In fact, this situation has been documented in several international reports that have been shaming Cyprus for many years now.
And we've done nothing about it. Corina Dimitriou, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you, Rosie.
You can subscribe to the Cyprus News Digest on iTunes for free and get the program downloaded to your phone or tablet so you can listen anytime, anywhere.
In collaboration with the Cyprus Mail, This is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Haralambous.
The biggest achievement of Crime Stoppers has been the ability of the public to be able to give information about crime anonymously.
There's no way I could have kept prostituting without the drugs. There's no way I could have had my body used like a public toilet, because that's actually what prostitution is.
And then the fourth series I started 3 days after I'd won the Oscar, so the whole of the Monarch of the Glen experience was all interplatted with the Gosford Park Oscar experience.
I was working with Ronnie James Dio, and David was going to reform Whitesnake in 2003.
Cyprus was chosen because Cyprus is a stable, peaceful and secure place.
We have to really look closely. What are we doing with children? What are we doing with adolescents? And what are we doing with adults that can help them move into a more literate situation?
The ones that I'm proudest of are the ones that were true discoveries, where we found something we didn't know existed.
In other news this week, along with many other countries around the world, Cyprus has experienced a spike, albeit a small one, in new coronavirus cases. 13 new cases were detected on Tuesday, most of them in Limassol. So the advisory committee to the Health Ministry was called in to discuss the issue, and the Cabinet was expected to also talk to them today. There's a fear that further lockdown measures could be put in place, and there have been agreements to carry out 5,000 tests on local residents in Limassol so that they can try and trace the spike, particularly since many of these new cases are what are called orphan cases, with no evidence that the people who've tested positive had any contact with previous cases. And the other story that we've been looking at over the past several weeks is that list of politically exposed persons, because apparently the Attorney General says making the list public, this is as regards their financial situation and the possible writing off of loans, well, he says it's legally incompatible, and the whole thing has gone back to the members of Parliament.
Keep up to date with events in Cyprus and around the world with the Cyprus News Digest.
Peace builders across Cyprus have for years been looking at different things which will engage both communities, and an interesting abstract was recently published by PRIO, the Peace Research Institute of Oslo. One of the co-authors was Maria Hadji-Mikhail. She joins us now. Maria, Environmental Protection and Cooperation in an Ethnically Divided Island was the title of your booklet. How did you go about looking at that aspect? Because we've done culture before, we've got the bicommunal choir, we've had quite a lot of cooperation in different areas. The environment is perhaps not one of the biggest ones. So tell me how you came to choose the environment, which has been somewhat neglected, I think, in this area of cooperation, as something to look at.
The report regarding the environment as an element of cooperation in Cyprus is only one of the reports in this linkages project, which is a one-year project that was put forward by PRIO. Cultures and education and a few other sectors are part of this project. The environment is particularly important, we feel, as even though on one hand there's been some work done in order to understand how the environment has been used and what is the potential of the environment towards peace building on Cyprus. We don't feel it has been explored enough, and what we tried to do was to explore through historical learning the potential of the environment on Cyprus. The interesting part regarding the environment as a peace-building element across the world is that it's promoted as an element that can bring people together. either the environmental protection or the protection of natural resources. In Cyprus, until now, at least in the more hegemonic rhetoric, the environment, we have seen that it's particularly used as a divisive element. So the example we bring forward in our report as a starting point is the example of quarrying in Cyprus. So in the Greek Cypriot community, quarrying has been used a lot, and Pentadastylos, the example of Pentadastylos in the quarries there and the environmental destruction that's taking place on Pentadastylos is continuously being used in the public sphere, whereas we ignore what's happening in Androlikou quarries, which is on Turkey's Cypriot land that was abandoned by its inhabitants in 1964 and 1974.
So what part does business play in this? Because the two examples you've given are businesses, and I would imagine that although they are important, most environmental protection, certainly in the south, seems to come from non-governmental organisations, and I would have thought there was more scope for cooperation there.
Yeah, definitely. So what I've given was an example of what's happening in the public sphere regarding how the environment is used as a divisive element. And what we have tried to bring forward is examples of environmental NGOs or how institutions like the UN, but also grassroots initiatives, how such groups or institutions are taking a step forward regarding how the environment can become an element of cooperation. And we explore the Cyprus Environment Stakeholder Forum and how that has changed over time. The Cyprus Environmental Stakeholder Forum started in 2007, and it was the first attempt to create a platform where particularly environmental NGOs and academics, and how from both communities, and how they were able to create and bring forward ideas of how environmental protection can take place bi-communally.
So can you give us some examples of successful cooperation that has bridged this divide and perhaps brought the communities together in saving an environment that, let's face it, belongs to all Cypriots?
I can give two examples. One is from the epistemic community, so from scientists, and one from environmental NGOs or initiatives. One example regarding scientists doing work bi-communally is the work that has been done which explored the biodiversity of the buffer zone, for example. So you had scientists from both the Greek Cypriot and the Turkish Cypriot community conducting research and co-producing new knowledge regarding the biodiversity in the buffer zone 40 years after it was abandoned. So 40 years after human activity paused, something that can be compared with the loss of biodiversity in the Greek Cypriot and the Turkish Cypriot communities. So that was a very important piece of work that can be put forward in order to claim the buffer zone as a space that has preserved in a way, even though it's a result of a violent conflict, it has created a refuge for biodiversity.
Yes, it's a bit like a nature reserve, isn't it? Where, if we look ahead, does this sort of research into these types of cooperations take us? How far, for example, can they influence policy decisions? For example, making the buffer zone, in the event of a solution, a nature reserve. open to both sides to enjoy. How far also does the cooperation continue after any research projects like the one you've mentioned are published, done and dusted? Do these groups stay in touch and keep on working together?
That really depends on the groups, on the persons, and what they aspire, they would like to do in a way.
Yes, but did you find that any of them had started cooperation, let's say 15 years ago, and were still in touch and looking at possible new projects?
There are some scientists and some environmental NGOs and some grassroots initiatives that have kept in contact and continue to look for grants in order to continue cooperation. But I think one of the important things here is to see how policy proposals put forward in a specific project, how those groups or scientists really push for those proposals to be implemented. And that takes political will from both sides, Turkish Cypriot and the Greek Cypriot administration, but also how willing the people and groups are to push for these changes. For example, with the case of the buffer zone, we put forward a very concrete proposal regarding the creation of an environmental study center in Varisha. It's an abandoned Greek Cypriot village in the buffer zone. So it can be a sort of home of cooperation, but for studying biodiversity and studying the environment by community. However, we feel that there's no political will from many groups and many institutions to really push for decisions like this to be taken. So there seems to be a lack of political will for pushing things forward.
That's true, I think, on both sides, isn't it? Neither side is particularly renowned for protecting the environment under its own administration, let alone trying to get together with the other to protect the whole thing.
Precisely. For example, another example of something that could be taken forward by from the different administrations is to conduct a study regarding the coastal zone and how future development on the coastal zone can ensure its protection in a way. We basically see the two sides acting and moving forward in terms of the environment as if the other side doesn't exist. And the example of the coastal zone is a very good one in my view. So we have in the Republic of Cyprus the government putting forward ideas and moving forward with developments such as marinas, different small marinas as well, and different developments along the coastline without taking on board that there are cumulative effects that can affect the dynamics of the coastal zone linked with development taking place in the northern side of the divide. And that goes for the administration of the Turkish Cypriot community as well.
Well, I think we've seen the disasters that have been perpetrated along both coasts, actually, or all coasts, so it's a little bit depressing. What do you do next? Are you going to do more research on this? Was it a one-off project or what?
The specific pre-report was a one-off project. We are hoping that more research can be done on this for the future. And as I mentioned, this report is a first attempt to understand how environmental cooperation has unfolded over time since 1998. on Cyprus.
And indeed how it can be used for peace building. We've got to stop it there, Maria. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Very good luck if you do continue with any form of research. But we'll ask people to look for the Prio Cyprus Centre, and they're on Facebook. They've also got a website, and your abstract was entitled Environmental Protection and Cooperation in an Ethnically Divided Island, the Case of Cyprus. Thank you for joining us. Well, that about wraps up this edition of the Cyprus News Digest. Many thanks for your company. Hope you'll join me next week. Till we meet again, take care and God bless. Bye-bye now.